All right, ready to dive in. Today we're going way back, early 1900s Missouri, to be exact.
Farm country.
Yeah, farm country. And the heart of our story, well, it's a woman named Bertha Gifford.
Sounds like a pretty normal name, right?
Exactly, but her story, oh, it's anything but normal.
It's one of those stories that makes you question, like, everything you thought you knew about, well,
Hmm.
human nature, I guess.
So our main source for this deep dive.
Excerpts from her Wikipedia page.
Exactly. And let me tell you, things get complicated. We're talking accusations of poisoning.
Multiple deaths, even.
And the big question we're trying to answer, was Bertha Gifford a kind woman caught in a web of unfortunate events, or was she a mastermind behind it all?
Yeah, like, was she secretly orchestrating these deaths?
Yeah.
It's a real head-scratcher.
Okay, so let's paint a picture of Bertha first. What was she like? I mean, before all this, well, darkness.
So from what I gathered, she was known as this really helpful neighbor, always willing to lend a hand.
A real pillar of the community.
Exactly. Famous for her cooking, always taking care of folks. She seems, like a genuinely good person.
But then,
But things take a dark turn.
yeah,
5 people died under her care.
5 people.
5. And obviously, that's going to raise some eyebrows, enough to spark a grand jury investigation.
Yeah, 5 deaths connected to one person. I mean, that's not something you can just ignore.
It's a pattern, right?
Definitely a pattern. So, okay, what were the actual accusations? What did they think Bertha had done?
Well, they suspected she was poisoning people,
Poisoning? Like, with what?
specifically with arsenic. It was pretty common back then, sadly.
Wow, arsenic. You always hear about it in like old mysteries and stuff, but I never thought about why it was so popular for, well,
Right. Well, it was actually pretty easy to get your hands on back then.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Arsenic was in medicines, pesticides, even some everyday household products. It's kind of creepy when you think about it.
It's a bit unsettling. So, was it ever proven? I mean, did they actually find arsenic in any of the victims?
Oh, they did. They exhumed the bodies of Edward Brindley and 2 young boys, Elmer and Lloyd Shamel, and their bodies showed high levels of arsenic.
So, case closed, right? It was Bertha.
Well, not exactly. The story takes another turn. Get this. She was found not guilty
Not guilty.
by reason of insanity.
Wait, what? Not guilty, but insane. So they knew something was wrong, but didn't convict her.
Yep. And she ended up spending the rest of her life in a mental institution.
That's got to leave a lot of unanswered questions.
Oh, absolutely. And it's fueled speculation for over a century now.
So what are people saying?
Some believe that Bertha might have been responsible for way more than just those 5 deaths.
How many more?
Some say as many as 17,
17.
which puts her in the same category as some pretty infamous female serial killers.
Like who?
Well, you've got Belle Gunness, Lydia Sherman, Jane Toppin, even Nanny Doss.
Wow. Okay, so we're talking potentially serial killer territory here.
It's a chilling thought, right?
It's definitely a lot to process. So I guess the question becomes why? Why would anyone do something like that?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Trying to understand the mind of someone who lived in a completely different time. We have to remember that back then, mental illness was often misunderstood, even feared.
So you're saying maybe she had a condition that could explain her actions.
Some historians believe she may have suffered from a personality disorder or a form of psychosis.
Things that wouldn't have been recognized or treated like they are today.
Exactly. But we also have to consider the context of the time.
What do you mean?
Well, the early 1900s. It was a different world health-wise. People died all the time from diseases we barely even think about now. Typhoid, tuberculosis.
Right. Modern medicine was still in its early stages back then.
And that means that distinguishing between, say, an illness and the effects of poisoning, that could be incredibly difficult.
So even if someone did show signs of poisoning, it might have been chalked up to something else entirely.
Exactly. And proving intent, well, that would have been even harder.
It makes you realize how tricky it can be to untangle the past,
Oh, absolutely. And it gets even more complicated when you factor in the whole arsenic situation. We talked about how it was in medicines, right?
Right.
Well, that means that even if they found traces of arsenic, it didn't automatically mean foul play. It could have been a misdiagnosis or, improper treatment.
So we're left with this huge question mark hanging over Bertha Gifford.
Was she a victim of circumstance, just a product of her time, or was there something more sinister going on?
We're basically playing historical detective here, trying to separate fact from fiction.
And we have to be careful about drawing conclusions based on limited information.
Right. So what else do we know about Bertha's life?
Well, we know she was married twice. First to a man named Henry Graham. Then, after his death, she married Eugene Gifford.
Okay. Any children?
Two, a daughter named Leela and a son named James.
But it sounds like there are still some pretty big gaps in our knowledge.
Especially when it comes to her inner world, her motivations. It's almost like we're looking at two different Berthas.
Yeah, it's hard to reconcile the image of a caring neighbor and a loving mother with, someone suspected of causing multiple deaths.
Human nature is a complicated thing.
It really makes you think, doesn't it, about the duality of people? I mean, can someone really be two completely different people at the same time?
I think so, yeah. It's like we want to put people in neat little boxes, good or bad. But real life, it's
Yeah.
just not that simple.
And when you add in the lack of hard evidence in Bertha's case, it makes it even more, I don't know, mysterious, I
Oh,
guess.
yeah, and it kind of turns everyone into an armchair detective.
Right. You're looking at the same limited facts and you can come to completely different conclusions.
It's all about interpretation.
Speaking of interpretation, let's talk about the arsenic again. We know it was in a lot of things back then, but was there a stigma around it too?
Oh, for sure. It had this nickname, inheritance powder.
Inheritance powder.
Yeah, because, well, there were rumors that people used it to, speed up inheritances.
So basically they knew it could be used for murder.
Exactly. It wasn't some big secret. It was a known danger, which, again, just adds another layer to Bertha's story. Even if some of those deaths were, accidental, you can't rule out the possibility that some were deliberate.
Especially when you consider how many people close to her, died.
It's a pattern that's hard to ignore.
Yeah.
And it brings us back to those other female serial killers we mentioned.
Belle Gunness, Lydia Sherman.
Right. They both supposedly used arsenic to poison, husbands, suitors.
For money, right.
Seems like it, yeah.
So it's like this morbid pattern emerges. Women using poison to, I don't know, exert some kind of control.
And it really challenges those old-fashioned stereotypes about who's capable of violence.
Yeah.
You know,
It's easy to picture, I don't know, a scary-looking guy as a serial killer, but these were ordinary women.
leading seemingly normal lives.
Which brings us back to Bertha. Was she this cold, calculating killer? Or was she, I don't know, a victim of her circumstances?
If she was responsible for all those deaths, what was her motivation? Money? Revenge? Or something else entirely?
Right, what was she hoping to gain?
It's so tempting to try and find, a single clear-cut motive.
Yeah, tie it all up in a neat little bow.
But human behavior is rarely that straightforward.
And you know what really gets me? One of the suspected victims was her first husband, Henry Graham.
Right.
I mean, how often do you hear about someone losing two spouses under, well, suspicious
It
circumstances?
definitely makes you wonder if there were any red flags, earlier on, signs that people maybe missed.
And what about her time in the mental institution? Did she ever admit to anything?
That's the thing. The details about her life after the trial, they're really scarce. We know she was diagnosed with dementia precox, but that's just an old term for schizophrenia.
So basically, we don't know much about what happened to her after she was committed.
Not really.
I guess that just adds to the mystery, huh?
It does. And it's a good reminder that sometimes we just don't have all the answers.
And maybe we never will.
Exactly. But that doesn't mean we stop looking, right?
It's like this case is still open, even though it happened over 100 years ago.
And that's the beauty of history. It's always evolving. New information can surface. Old evidence can be reinterpreted.
It makes you think about whose version of history we're really getting, right?
It-
Who's telling the story and why.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
Especially in a case like Bertha's, where it's so hard to say who was the victim and who, if anyone, was the villain.
It definitely makes you question everything you thought you knew about history.
History is rarely neat and tidy. It's messy, full of contradictions, and it's always open to interpretation.
So, big picture, what are we learning from Bertha's story? What are the takeaways here?
Well, on a basic level, it's a reminder that we can't judge a book by its cover, right?
Appearances can be deceiving.
Exactly. Even the most unassuming person can have secrets.
It also makes you realize how important context is.
Trying to understand someone's actions without understanding their time period is just impossible,
Their social norms, their beliefs.
right? You have to see the whole picture.
And most importantly, I think, it teaches us to be critical thinkers, to question what we're told, and to consider all the different sides of a story.
Bertha's story is like a puzzle with missing pieces. We may never know for sure what really happened.
But that shouldn't stop us from trying to figure it out.
Exactly.
It makes you wonder, right? Like, what would happen if a case like Bertha's popped up today?
Oh, that's an interesting thought.
I mean, with all the technology we have now, DNA testing, all that stuff.
Forensic science has come a long way since the early 1900s, that's for sure.
Would we even be having this conversation? Would it even be a mystery?
It's hard to say, really. Back then, they relied so much on, like, witness statements and, you know,
Circumstantial evidence.
right, exactly. But today, we can analyze, like, microscopic traces of stuff.
Build timelines, profiles.
Yeah, we can get a much clearer picture of what might have happened.
But even with all that,
There are still some things we may never know for sure.
human behavior can be,
Unpredictable.
yeah, unpredictable. I guess it's kind of humbling, right? Even with all our fancy tools and knowledge.
Definitely.
But I guess it doesn't mean we stop trying to understand, right?
No, not at all. I think Bertha's case shows us just how important it is to keep asking questions, to keep digging.
Because you never know what might turn up.
Exactly.
Mm.
New evidence, new ways of looking at old evidence.
Like that saying, history is written by the winners.
Oh, yeah.
But in a case like this, where it's so blurry, who the good guys and bad guys are.
It makes you think about whose story is really being told, right?
Right. And if we're even getting the whole story.
That's what makes these kinds of historical deep dives so fascinating.
So where does all this leave us? What have we learned about Bertha Gifford?
I think, at the very least, it's a reminder that things aren't always what they seem.
Like anyone can be hiding something.
Exactly. And it's so important to understand the context of, well, of everything.
To see things from the perspective of the time.
Right. Because trying to understand someone's actions without considering their time period,
It's like trying to read a book with half the pages missing.
perfect analogy. And I think the biggest takeaway, we have to think for ourselves.
To be skeptical.
Exactly. Don't just accept what you're told. Look at the evidence. Consider different perspectives.
Because in Bertha's case, the evidence is, well,
It's murky.
yeah, it's murky. And that leaves us with more questions than answers. Was Bertha Gifford a victim of circumstance? A product of her time? Or was she a cold, calculating killer? We may never know for sure. What do you think?
That's the beauty of it, right? Keeps us thinking, keeps us engaged with history. And who knows, maybe someday new evidence will come to light and change everything we thought we knew. But until then, Bertha Gifford's story remains a captivating mystery, a reminder that the past is never truly settled.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the enigmatic life of Bertha Gifford. We'll see you next time for another fascinating journey into the depths of history.